Hey, okay, so we are talking about the Clean Air Act this week. So I put this image in because to give you some perspective, the Clean Air Act was passed just 1 year after this shot was taken, when we put the first astronaut on the moon. And I think it really, the reason I put that here is because for a time frame, but also because we probably take for granted this image of the Earth from space. But this was the first color image that people saw from space, back towards the Earth, like the picture of the Earth. And so people at that time had never seen what we call the Earthrise photo. And this really had a lot of power in terms of the environmental movement, seeing us as as a sphere from space really was a powerful image. Okay, so anyways, that's why I put that there for you to think about. Okay, Clean Air Act was in 1970. Well, that was the first one, the first part of it. There's other, amendments after that. Um, but also, I think people don't really have a concept of how awful and dirty air used to be prior to 1970. I think I've shown you some pictures in class, but I do encourage you to Google Clean Air Act images because it's kind of amazing. I don't think I put any in here. We'll see. There was a joke at the time that Pittsburgh's air was so dirty you had to floss your teeth after breathing. Um, there were, smog pictures from New York City and California that you probably have seen. And so this was really an unprecedented American environmental law. It was like really groundbreaking, and it represents something really that hadn't happened before. Unlike little piecemeal things like, we were trying to do this over here, we were trying to do that. The Clean Air Act was an established, uniform, national standard covering a wide range of pollutants, and sources, and that made it very, very different. And it was hoped actually at the time that clean air problems would be solved. But we're about 5 decades and hundreds of billions of dollars later, and we still have this, our air is dramatically cleaner than in 1970, but still, and I think this is in one of the slides, but let me see. Yes, still this was 2024, over 109 million people nationwide still live in areas that fail to meet the Clean Air Act requirements. So that's a lot of people who are still living without, not in places where the standards are met. And so this tells you something really important about environmental law. It's not just standards, it's complex. It's an interplay of economics, technology, politics, and human behavior, which we've been talking about all semester. So that should be no surprise. One important item I don't think I said yet, maybe is in this. Nope. Is that the Clean Air Act actually is one of the, in terms of like government or um, civics, it's one of the most fascinating pieces of cooperative federalism that we have. And cooperative federalism is basically when the federal and the state governments share responsibility for implementing something. And this is exactly that. So before we can understand the Clean Air Act structure, we have to talk about what we're regulating, right? So air pollution isn't just one single problem, like one single thing going into the air that we need to regulate. It's a whole bunch of pollutants, a whole bunch of sources, right? So we have thousands of pollutants potentially. We have some sources that move around, cars and trucks, and other things that are very stationary. We have varying levels of health impact. Um, Some are really egregious, right? Vinyl chloride can be immediately dangerous. And most air pollution works differently, where it's sort of like a chronic exposure. And toxins are regulated differently. They're not necessarily they don't spend a lot of time in this chapter. But we can we can do that separately, but most air pollution that we're going to regulate and talk about is not toxic, where you can have like an immediate dangerous reaction. Uh, it is more the type of stuff that aggravates health conditions, increases the incidence or severity of respiratory diseases, asthma, pneumonia, things like that. And the CDC, is that in here? The CDC reports that lung disease is the sixth leading cause of death in the United States, and 34 million Americans suffer from chronic lung disease, and that has been correlated with fine particulates and premature death. And in urban areas, smog, which is ozone. Thank you. Come on, that's my dog. Um, Smog ozone or O3, there's two types of ozone, so just so we know, is produced by reactions between nitrogen oxides and volatile organic compounds. And second, fine particulate matter does lodge in the lungs. So those are some well-known health effects that we know of based on like very prominent. Um, Air pollutants. But beyond the health concerns, some things that can happen, I don't know if you've heard of it, is like acid rain, right? So it's not just a health consequence, but we can have the situation where the pollutants that we put in the air create these acidic compounds and they deposit miles and miles away onto things like trees and in aquatic ecosystems. And that's called acid rain. And the Germans called that Waldsterben or forest death. But anyways, so from a regulator's perspective, the air pollution problem is made difficult because air pollutants arise from many different sources. There's vehicle emissions are responsible for about three-quarters of the carbon monoxide emissions, about half of the nitrous oxides, and a quarter of the volatile organic compounds. So power plants are also important emitters, but they usually emit um, sulfur dioxide and nitrous oxides. Incinerators and industrial sources have a lot of hazardous pollutants, but are actually, but surprisingly, so are motor vehicles. So these pollutants create this like mixture in the air, and they move with the wind. And depending on the topography, they can often get trapped into valleys, and they don't stay neatly inside state lines. So. Just to be clear, this when we're talking about the Clean Air Act, the Clean Air Act addresses carbon monoxide, CO. Carbon dioxide, the thing that we talk about in climate change, is a different. Is it a chemical or a compound? I feel like that's a compound. CO2. Anyway. I digress. So we're talking about carbon monoxide, okay? If we were talking about carbon dioxide, the transportation sector accounts for only about 28% of greenhouse gas emissions, but um, we're talking about carbon monoxide in this particular, for the Clean Air Act specifically. So there's four key regulatory questions. So when they put together the Clean Air Act in 1970, they faced four basic questions that they had to address and figure out in order to create this regulation. The first was, what's the threshold? Like, which pollutants are we going to regulate, and how do we prioritize them? Which ones are worse and which ones aren't as bad? And should the ones that are very, very common be treated differently than the ones that are really rare but toxic? That's sort of the first bullet up there, right? And then how much do we regulate? Once you've identified that pollutant D needs to be regulated, what level do we put it at? What do we say is allowed? And most people end up answering, well, at the level that protects public health. But there isn't one level that protects public health, because whose health? The average person, a sensitive person, an asthmatic child, an elderly person, a person with other comorbidities. Like the average person if you put it on the average, you're still going to be causing quite a few people harm. So protecting the average person is less costly, but should the cost really influence our decision here? Um, and is having clean air like an individual right? Are we violating people's rights? Why is this? I am distracted. Okay. The third bullet there is how, like, where do we regulate? Ideally, we'd regulate based on risk to the individual, acceptors, where the person breathes in the air. Um, but this is technically impossible and would create common law issues all over the place, right? How do we prove what caused what? So we generally move upstream from ideal regulation to the from the individual exposure to populations to ambient air, concentrations that are in the ambient air around us. So each step is further from the ideal and relies more on like what we would call a proxy measure. And then how do we regulate it? Which tool do we use in the toolbox? Should mobile sources be regulated differently than stationary sources? Should new sources be regulated different than existing sources? And while national uniform standards make sense for pollutants that cross state lines, is that always going to work? Is it always efficient? I don't know, right? So those are the main questions they had to answer. And one of the key things that they came up with, one of the key cornerstones of the Clean Air Act, is called the NAAQS, National Ambient Air Quality Standards. Um, these cover what we call criteria pollutants, pollutants that are emitted from numerous sources that endanger public health. There are 6 of them. Are they on here? I don't know if they're all on here. Ozone, ground level ozone, nitrogen dioxide, carbon monoxide, fine particulates, sulfur dioxide, and lead. Just to be clear, we're talking about ground level ozone. That is a criteria pollutant. It's a component of smog. It irritates the lungs. It damages crops. It is not the stratospheric ozone that shields us from UV radiation because we want some of that. Remember when we had a hole in the ozone layer? That was bad. This is different. This is ground level ozone. Also, you might have seen that at some point there was 7 because there was another one. Hydrocarbons used to also be on the list, and it was taken off. So 6. Um, so basically, the EPA is required to review all kinds of available science on each of these pollutants, these 6 criteria pollutants, to see if they occur naturally, and if there's human sources, their impacts on ecosystems, and various levels of, on human health and the environment. And they set the level, but they don't set the steps to achieve that level. So the EPA sets the level, but they don't actually set the um, how anybody's going to achieve that level. So the NAAQS established uniform levels that cannot be exceeded, and the standard requires, quote, protect the public health with an adequate margin of safety. What this phrase means has been up for debate, but that's what they have been tasked to do with these NAAQS. When the EPA set lead standards, it did go to Lead Industries Association versus EPA. That was a critical case. And they chose young children as the group that they were the target population potentially for this because they knew children to be really, what is the word I'm looking for? Not susceptible to uh, they are harmed more likely by lead than adults because it's sort of the dose is the response and the people are smaller, they can take less of it. So they chose children as the target vulnerable group and set a standard based on children. And the Lead Industries Association sued, say that you shouldn't be allowed to set the standard that is to that specific vulnerable population. And the court held that EPA had the discretion to determine that adequate margin of safety. And that the standard had to be based solely on health consideration. So you see one of these is it cannot consider economic or feasibility, technical feasibility. Um, that was also another court case, EPA versus American Trucking Association. It cannot um, put into the equation whether it's achievable or not. They just set the limit based on that. I'm not sure if I have. Oh yeah, I do. My head's in the way. There are two types of NACs, the primary standards to protect human health, and the second is to protect public welfare, including effects on animals, wildlife, water, visibility, things like that. And the EPA is supposed to review the existing standards and consider new ones every 5 years. Oh, here's the EPA versus lead. They're supposed to review existing standards and consider new ones every 5 years. In practice, that has been very slow. I mentioned there's only ever been seven. Hydrocarbons was on the list. It was removed. Lead was added, and that's all that's ever happened since 1983. Um, so it's not a lot of review and additions and subtractions happening. So why national standards? Critics argue that it's inefficient because, how do we control the costs? Like I said, some ambient air can get stuck in places and valleys and whatnot. And that doesn't seem fair to some people. Um, and then when you set the standard for a most vulnerable population, you're by definition overprotecting some parts. So, but there are also compelling reasons for uniformity, right? It's way easier administratively if there is one limit, it's easier to establish, easier to monitor, easier to enforce. And second, the concern was if it wasn't a uniform standard across the United States, that there would be sort of what we would call a race to the bottom. There would be pollution havens where if we said more was allowed here, all the polluting industries would just go here, and then that wouldn't be fair to the people that lived around there, right? So that was the second reason. And the third reason was, we something that seems overprotective today may prove to be completely appropriate tomorrow as we get to know more, science has more information. Okay, so we have the six criteria pollutants, and then what do we do? We are going to talk about basically stationary rules, and stationary is for any building, structure, facility, installation that emits anything pollution into the air, and mobile sources, basically cars and trucks. So there's state implementation plans, and what happens is so the EPA sets the level federally, and then they give it to the states, and the state has to make an implementation plan. And that's why I called that cooperative federalism, because the NACS system really exemplifies cooperative federalism. It's a nationwide standard, but the state is in charge of achieving it and enforcing it. And submitting to the EPA how they've achieved that. By certain deadlines. So it does start, it at first seems like a broad state authority allowing a lot of different approaches, but in practice, there's a lot of limitations on the state. So new source performance standards, I don't know if I have another slide for this. No. Okay. So for instance, new source performance standards are federal standards for brand new sources, those are not done by state. Major existing sources that are in areas that can't achieve the NACs have to do federally mandated different things, right? And then vehicle emissions for our mobile sources are all set federally, except for California, right? So even though it's like the federal sets the limit and the state gets to go do the state implementation plan, in reality, the primary thing that the state is doing is regulating existing sources because new sources end up being federal. Major existing sources that are in an area that hasn't been able to achieve the level go back to federal, and vehicle emissions are federal. So basically, the state is in charge of regulating something that's already existing. So any stationary source emitting 100 tons or more of one of these criteria pollutants, 10 10 tons of hazardous pollutants or 25 tons of combined hazardous pollutants must obtain a permit under a state uh, implementation plan. The EPA only considers whether the overall state implementation plan will achieve the NAAQS. It doesn't review all the different permits that a state gives out. If the EPA thinks that the SIP that the state submits isn't going to achieve the NAAQS, then it can say, well, we're going to take over and make a federal implementation plan. It doesn't happen all that much, but so what happens when like a state says we can't reach this level, we can't reach it, we just can't. Many states that happens to, and what happens is that area or that county or that state is considered non-attainment. They cannot attain the level of pollutants that the Clean Air Act requires. So if you remember, I'm going to go back for 1 second. I had said at the beginning, there are still 109 million people living in counties where the concentrations are above this. This basically means that they are in non-attainment areas, right? Where this is not being achieved. Okay, so there's a lot of SIPs that have failed to achieve the NAAQS, and it creates a non-attainment area. And this has really been the most challenging part of the Clean Air Act. One of the most serious non-attainment areas has been Southern California. I think I have that on here somewhere. I put Los Angeles. Smog alerts used to be routine during weather forecasts, and some areas in California have never, even since the beginning of the Clean Air Act, ever achieved ozone attainment. For each criteria pollutant, you're either in attainment or in a non-attainment area. You can be in a non-attainment area for ozone, but in attainment for carbon monoxide, right? So it depends on, you don't just get non-attainment if anything, right? Enforcing it is really difficult because even though I said the federal government could come in and make a federal implementation plan, that's rarely done. Because the EPA could try to say, oh, we're going to deny you federal funding for this highway, or we're going to, not allow you any federal permits until you fix this. But, you know, they haven't used that lever. I think that they have realized that that would be economically disastrous. And so postponement of deadlines becomes inevitable, and because we don't want a massive economic disruption. For some of these areas to achieve attainment would be really it would require massive upheaval of their economic system. So, for instance, in 1988, I'm not sure if this is the slide. No. In 1988, there was a study of LA about the NAAQS and said it would, in order for LA to reach the NAAQS, be an attainment area, would require prohibiting almost all traffic, shutting down major businesses, and just completely destroying the regional economy and forcing large portions of the population to relocate. That was obviously not a viable solution. So they have done their best to sort of muddle along to just make sure they're getting better. There were some changes in the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments that made it a little bit easier, not easier, but made attainment, instead of sort of a yes, no, made it a level. So there's marginal attainment, moderate, marginal non-attainment, moderate non-attainment, serious, severe, and extreme. So that different levels could be treated differently. And the idea would be that we just want to see some progress. And reasonable further progress became sort of the name of the game after 1990s. Okay, did I have another slide? Yes. Okay, so I had mentioned new source performance standards. The NAAQS regulates ambient air. The rest of the Clean Air regulates emissions sources. So the very next thing is, what about the sources? And this is a way to sort of indirectly um, set a standard without just talking about ambient air. So I think I put it in here, did I? Section 111 of the Clean Air Act requires the EPA to set emission standards for new or modified stationary sources. The new source performance standards, the NSPS you see here, covers about 70 facility categories and applies to major sources. So when you're a new source, this becomes a technology in your toolkit. Remember, this becomes a technology, control technology. It's best available pollution control technology has to be used. They are a lot, so you're indirectly considering cost because an exorbitant new technology wouldn't be feasible, is not required. And you need to get a permit, and you need to go through new source review. Um, and it covers both new sources and if you make a major modification to an old source. That's this standard. So there's NACS and now there's new source performance standards. The federal government does this, right? The law treats new and existing sources very differently through grandfathering. That's what you're seeing here. So it's only a major modification to an older source. So it's either a brand new or a major modification. So existing operating facilities, when the Clean Air Act passed, they don't have to meet the NSPS unless they undertake this major modification, right? So the idea was, we're going to grandfather in some things that are polluting, but as new things are built, they will all be up to par. And then, these old facilities will be phased out and eventually we'll have just much cleaner air. And it seemed really, really reasonable given that retrofitting some of these 1970s, 1950s even plants just was going to be so expensive for these companies. So it was expected to be a temporary thing where eventually plants would shut down. But what happened was instead, it created what we called, remember a couple of weeks ago, a perverse incentive to keep the older, dirtier facilities as long as possible, right? And to sort of like patch them together to keep them going. Um, and, maintenance and repair. Okay, sorry. So what happened was there was this real perverse incentive to keep the older, dirtier facilities operating longer and longer and longer, not make major modifications to them, just make minor improvements to keep these plants emitting 4 to 10 times more pollutants than if they were new. Um, so that didn't work out exactly as we thought, but um, so why is the federal government in charge of this part? Well, efficiency. It's more cost effective for the EPA than 50 different states to understand what's technically capable nowadays. And also to prevent, again, that competition, the race to the bottom sort of problem where different states would say, well, I'm going to put a new facility in Massachusetts because they have the lowest standards, right? So to make the standard across the board. But again, this is a technology standard. This isn't a standard that says you have to hit X pollutant. This is you have to use this technology to make sure your stuff is this clean. Um, oh, I just said all that stuff. This was the grandfathering problem of the NSPS. If it was a major modification, sorry, dog is loose. Okay, lots of interruptions today. Okay, so grandfathering problem. Okay, so there also are some market. Remember one of the tools in the toolkit that we talked about was market mechanisms. And over the decades, the Clean Air Act has had some opportunity to experiment with some trading mechanisms that have influenced environmental policies. So uh, trading addresses a couple challenges. So we want to minimize the cost of achieving the pollution goals that we all want and still allow for some economic growth while we're reducing pollution. So there's a couple of them. I think my head is near them, but bubbling is probably the most common one. And we talked about that a little bit when we talked about cap and trade. It's the idea that you put sort of an invisible bubble over an industrial site that has 4 plants in it. Each emits 10 tons of dimethyl annually. A 10% reduction requirement by the government could be met uniformly with all of the buildings across. Or, the least expensive way in one of the plants could do all of the reducing, and the other ones maintain their sort of pollution. So you have to make sure you are regulating the emissions under the imaginary bubble. Netting is another one. That is to avoid new source review, which is more stringent. If a company wants to modify part of its plants in a way that would increase emissions, it can net out that increase by reducing emissions somewhere else at the same facility. Then it can avoid the new source review, and that is largely desired by most companies. Offsets is another one. In a non-attainment area by creating sort of what we call a regional bubble. New sources must offset emissions by securing reductions at some other existing source. But a 1990 amendment required that more stringency in the offsets, because you don't want, again, the race to the bottom state to state. And there are some other, requirements of that. I'm not sure if I put it on this one. Okay, so if you're building a new major source or doing a major modification in a non-attainment area, you have to obtain emissions offsets from other sources in that area. And we did talk about cap and trade already. You allow pollution, and then you basically give out, permits to pollute. You keep trying to reduce it. And if I have extras, I can bank them, I can sell them. It's like having allowances to make sure you can. It's a tricky lever to pull, but you can do it. The Clean Air Act. Oh, there's bubbling and netting. I don't know why there's some sort of seal under netting. Um, a regional bubble. Yeah, said all that stuff. So, the Clean Air Act's first trading program targeted lead and gasoline in 1982, and refiners received lead content credits and could trade or bank them. This was to try to combat acid rain, when the Midwest power plants were burning stuff that was creating acid rain in the Northeast. But we also had SO2 allowances. Those were that was what very well received and worked very well. It reduced emissions by 10 million tons, over 50% below 1980s levels. And then, we're 90% below that now. So it's worked really, really well. But sulfur dioxide is a measurable pollutant. It's easier to monitor at a smokestack. There was very little dispute about how it was happening. So like sometimes people are like, oh, why don't we just do that for everything? Well, that particular one worked, sort of like how we solved the hole in the ozone very quickly and easy. It's like easier to target this one thing that we know where it comes from. And only there's this like one action that if we just tweaked would fix it. And that is sort of what happened with sulfur dioxide too. And the penalties were pretty harsh for that too. So that was a success story. Um, Also, though, there were some other sort of like social factors that happened at the same time. We deregulated the railroads, and it was shipping sulfur became easier. So it also had an effect. Just again to keep in mind, as this is an environmental justice related course, there are trading drawbacks. It does create areas of hot spots. It does concentrate pollution very often, raising environmental justice concerns, meaning one group, generally speaking, poor, marginalized, people of color, tend more often to be next to polluting facilities. And if you just if you don't have to do it over here, you can just, make, if I don't have to reduce this, if I keep the pollution here, you may be keeping it on a community that's already overburdened, um, and concentrating that. Um, in 2008, do I have that one? Yeah, I did say some of this. In 2008, North Carolina versus EPA challenged some trading programs, and the court held that Clean Air Interstate Rule, CARE, could violate prohibitions against contributing significantly to other states' non-attainment. So now there is this thing called cross-state air pollution rule, that state emissions budgets can only trade within their states. Because if Massachusetts can trade with Rhode Island, we could keep all the pollution in Rhode Island, and that doesn't seem fair to people in Rhode Island, that sort of thing. So that was established in, uh, did I just say? 2008. Air pollution does, I mean, we obviously know this, it ignores state boundaries. So downwind states are more vulnerable. Um, And in the 1970s, the Clean Air Act requires upwind states to not significantly contribute to downwind states' non-attainment. So, in other words, if every state is just supposed to create a non-attainment, but like Massachusetts, we're doing everything we can, and air from, I don't know, New York just keeps blowing on us. That's not fair. It's actually New York's problem. That's called the Good Neighbor provision, and it's one of the 1977 amendments to the Clean Air Act, and it requires the state implementation protocol to control emissions that would prevent another state from um, reaching attainment. And the EPA has disproved a couple dozen at least state plans for their inadequate reductions based on this good neighbor clause. So downwind states can also petition the EPA to say, hey, this isn't fair. Um, but the amendments strengthen this by requiring each state's SIP to say that they were, to just demonstrate how they were not going to significantly contribute to other states' non-attainment. Another part of the Clean Air Act is the Prevention of Significant Deterioration, or PSD program, which addresses areas that are already meeting the NAAQS. It was a court decision and part of the 1977 Clean Air Act amendments. And it basically established requirements to protect and enhance air quality in places where there was attainment already. So it divides the country into classes with varying restrictions. Like class one is areas like national parks, class two, most other areas, and then three and four. I think there's four. That's why I feel like it's four, maybe there's three. Um, in increments, it limits the concentration of increases that can happen to try to keep air quality well below the NAAQS, especially in places like a national park. Um, we had decided at some point that preserving clean air in undeveloped areas and national parks, um, and rather than distributing more of the dirty everywhere, that we should keep some places that are spectacularly clean. Okay, so the whole other side of the Clean Air Act is about cars and trucks, right? Mobile sources. Mobile sources contribute about, I said this already, about 3/4 of the carbon monoxide, over half of the nitrous oxides, and almost half of the volatile organic compounds. Most ozone and carbon monoxide non-attainment areas fail because of automobile emissions. So, one thing they mentioned in the text, I think, is the 2011 Carmageddon weekend in LA. And I think there was some data about this, although I haven't seen it in peer review yet, about COVID-19 decreases in people commuting. But there was a weekend in LA in 2011 where the 405 was closed for repairs, the major highway in California, and air quality improved about 75%. Just from that one weekend of traffic. So, Title II of the Clean Air Act regulates mobile sources through tailpipe emission standards. and it regulates cars and light trucks. You may notice that large trucks, like those used for transportation, cargo, etc., are not covered. That is clearly a nod to economic interests. Mobile source regulation focuses on car emissions and the formulation of gasoline. So, despite the increase in vehicles, lead has decreased about 90%. I don't know if that's in this. Maybe it's in my next. I'll fast forward just in case it's in the next one. Yeah. Okay. Um, and other pollutants have dropped significantly. So despite the fact that we have way more cars in 1970, we're still doing pretty good. Congress gave EPA the authority rather than the states, primarily because if you think of it from an automaker's perspective, I can't make a car for Massachusetts, a car for Rhode Island, a car for Connecticut. I have to make like cars for all the states. California does have special authority to set stricter standards due to its very unique pollution problems, especially with ozone. And it already had a Clean Air Act amendment, I mean, a Clean Air Act at the state level before the Clean Air Act was nationwide. Other states are free to adopt California's. I don't think any of them have. Um, and let's see. Yeah, I don't know if I have a slide on California, but it was bad. No. Okay. Um, California, just for a little bit of background, had such severe air pollution problems, particularly in LA, dating back to the 40s and 50s. Smog was like a public health crisis. Um, well before the rest of the country was paying attention to air pollution. So they did have that's when we watched the Volkswagen movie that talked about CARB. It's the California Air Resources Board that was established in 1966 or 67 because there was such bad air quality in California. And then when the Clean Air Act was passed, it sort of had to say like generally, we want nationwide vehicle emission standards, but we'll allow you to keep yours, California, since yours was here first, actually. Mobile source regulations are technology forcing. Again, right? They are not sort of like 2 parts per million ambient air quality type stuff. They are literally make the technology so that this is what comes out the end of the pipe. And in the 1970 Act required 90% reductions in car emissions by the mid 1970s using technologies that did not even exist. So this reflected like massive optimism for our technology post moon landing, which nod to the picture. You know, like go and figure it out, car companies, because this is the you need a technology that does this. And EPA had the authority to shut down the entire auto industry if it didn't come into compliance. Now I don't know if they would have done that. It's kind of a bluff, um, by the early 1980s, the catalytic converter was invented, used widely, and that was a major part of the reduction. Um, it was a big breakthrough, an invention too. And therefore, they didn't need to follow through with any threats. But if you do threaten, you should make a credible threat, right? Another thing you might have heard of, let's see if I have a slide for it. I don't know if I do. Um, yeah, I mean, you do have to be a little careful about, you know, making a threat like that in a standard or whatever. But one other thing that you might have heard of are the CAFE standards. CAFE standards for vehicles are actually set by the Secretary of Transportation, and the EPA then measures compliance. And CAFE standards are basically corporate average fuel economy, CAFE. And they were enacted in 1975 after the oil embargo in 1973. And they basically say you automaker have to meet a minimum average fuel economy across your entire fleet of vehicles. So if a manufacturer makes some cars that really don't get a very good gas mileage, they have to offset them by having some cars on their lot that are very fuel efficient, right? So like we'll look at the almost like a bubble, but for car maker. Um, so the one piece that I have to point out is there they the cafe standards apply to passenger cars and light trucks. No, it's passenger cars and there was a phrase for it. Passenger cars and light trucks. Light trucks and autos, right? That's what I said. Light trucks and autos. Um, But what happened was there were two standards set. So passenger cars had a higher standard, something like 27 miles per gallon. Light trucks had a lower standard. Light truck was meant to cover like actual work trucks, like farm trucks, contractors, people that were using trucks to work. Um, and the assumption was that ordinary consumers drove cars. But what happened was automakers realized they could put the minivan and SUV and market light trucks to consumers who just want a light truck because it's truck season, right? So they all snuck under the lower requirement to keep their fleet at a cafe standard. They could have the miles per gallon higher. And so it inadvertently potentially created another perverse incentive where automakers could make more profit off SUVs and trucks, and those face less stringent fuel economy standards, so they've pushed those towards consumers, and we've bought them. So through the 1990s and 2000s, American fleet shifted dramatically towards SUVs and light trucks, which worsened average fuel economy nationally, even though the technology was improving. So it was designed to improve fuel economy, but may have inadvertently or maybe not create the SUV boom, etc. So standards have been updated and they're trying to squeeze the gap between cars and light trucks because of that. But the two-tier system still happens. So let's see what else I have. Okay, so yeah, the Clean Air Act, we have had massive improvements in our air quality, so we should be proud of what we've done. Um, we can our vehicle miles have doubled, our economy has grown. But on the other side of the coin, and we've managed to like maintain air or improve it drastically in most instances. But also, 109 million people are still in non-compliance areas. And maybe potentially more importantly, a piece that's missing here is we are content like the vehicle double vehicle miles, like the economy growth, like all that needs to be addressed. We can't continue to lean on hoping that like our throwaway society, our individualism, our drive everywhere in a bigger and bigger and bigger car, those things have consequences, and lifestyle and behavior changes really would need to happen to have air quality be what people really want it to be. And they need to see those two things as connected, or we probably will not have. We are a very car dependent society. We are a very energy inefficient society. And those things really should improve. We shouldn't force all of it through the Clean Air Act, through regulations. Some of it needs or should be through lifestyle changes. Um, also, um, the Clean Air Act was primed to address climate change, and the endangerment finding being rescinded very recently has put that on jeopardy. But it wasn't one of the NACs. It isn't, it isn't something that would have been through that. It would have been able to classify CO2 as a pollutant, which it had, and then it would have been able to regulate it in stationary sources. And there were the beginnings of some arguments about how that was going to happen, and now it appears to be rescinded. So that is another thing. Greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act, role of personal habits. Okay. The other thing I wanted to talk about a tiny bit, just to make sure we're relating this to environmental justice, is to remind you that people of color make up 42% or less than half, much less than, I'm going to say 40-ish% of the US population, but are almost 60% of those living in counties with unhealthy levels of air pollution, and 53% of the counties with the worst air quality. Okay, so they make up more than half of the people with the worst air quality, even though they're not more than half of the population. And people of color are 1.5 times more likely to live in an area with poor air quality than white people. That's according to the American Lung Association. The first one was the University of Michigan. They study a lot of environmental justice stuff. A UC Berkeley study from, let's see if I have the year. No. Yes. They did a study between 2012 and 2019, and they had hundreds of monitoring stations across California and found that communities with higher proportions of minority populations were consistently exposed to elevated concentrations of nitrogen dioxide and fine particulate matter compared to predominantly white communities. And there's another one. People with a lower income were exposed to higher average particulate matter levels than higher income groups. That was a WHO Harvard Chan public health study. And then the EPA itself, people of color breathe more particulate air pollution on average, a finding that holds across income levels and regions in the United States. That was in April 2021. So I just want to make clear that we did all of this about the Clean Air Act, and we do want ambient air quality better, and we have made great strides. Where I feel like we aren't making the greatest strides is like we found that the target was going to be at the source and then in ambient air. In the ambient air, we are, like it said at the beginning, we're like 5 levels removed from the source that's creating it. And that disconnect has continued to really amplify the fact that some areas are cleaner than others. Some air is better to breathe in some areas than others. And that the fact of the matter is, in places where there's wealthy and white populations, the air is generally cleaner to breathe. And that is an important thing to remember as we start to think of where could we go next with the Clean Air Act? What could it address? How could it address it differently? Potentially in existing stationary sources, new stationary sources, or in the NACs. So that's it. Thanks.